For local control, we're going to start out today trying to get through the first 10 tasks. This is not meant to be a complete breakdown of every single task and every single definition. Some of these are self-explanatory, and the definition itself is good enough for use. This is meant to more expand upon some of the tasks and discuss some of the high points and how they apply either to local control, specifically in the Air Force or in the FAA or as a general aviation contractor. So we'll kind of go task by task and we'll pick the high spots. So first task is use of active runways. This is your foundation, and understanding runways and how they're used is important. A runway is a defined rectangular area on a land airport prepared for the landing and takeoff of aircraft along its length. Runways are normally numbered in relation to the magnetic direction, rounded off to the nearest 10 degrees. What that means is we used to be runway 22, and so that meant that the actual degrees was somewhere in the range between 220 and 225. When it gets up to the higher spot, then it gets down to runway 23. And so that's why our change to our magnetic heading changed our actual runways and how we designate them. Runway in use is any runway or runways currently being used for takeoff or landing. When multiple runways are used, they are all considered active runways. For example, runway, our north and south base runway, and then we have main base runway 23 left and 23 right. Active runway is any runway or runways currently being used for takeoff or landing. When multiple runways are used, they are all considered active runways. Next, we're going to go down to state when the controller has responsibility for operations conducted on the active runway. The local controller has primary responsibility for operations conducted on the active runway and must control the use of those runways. That means it's up to you. I mean, the SOOP has ultimate responsibility for the tower cab and the overall flow of traffic, but it's your responsibility to maintain control of the active runways. When coordination is required between local control and ground control, use of active runway. A big example with this for us at Edwards is going to be Ramp 2. Local control and ground controllers must exchange information as necessary for the safe and efficient use of airport runways and movement areas. When we're landing helicopters over Ramp 2, that's why it's required for us to coordinate with ground control, and it's not required if we already own runway 23 left. We don't have to tell ground control about it, but we must tell ground when we're going to be landing at any other than an active runway, and Ramp 2 is a good example of that. State when local control has a responsibility to scan runways. Our responsibility is to the maximum extent possible, and the reason that that's so important is because of human error. You could have a vehicle on the runway, and you start scanning the runway, or you don't know that you may have an aircraft on the runway that hasn't exited yet, and you have another aircraft that's coming in for landing, and you thought they turned off at Bravo. It's essential to scan the runway prior to issuing a landing clearance or departure clearance, specifically because of that reason, because of human error. We're going to go down to task 2 now, of transfer position responsibilities, team position responsibilities, and supervisor notification requirements. We're going to define when to perform the position relief checklist. That's any time that we're doing the position relief. And what's important about that is to do a preview of the position. You should be able to tell when you walk up to the position, after you plug in and you're hearing what's going on, you're seeing who's taxiing, who's not taxiing, who's in the air. You should be able to tell about 90% of what's going on prior to the brief. And that helps too, because that way the local controller does not have to explain quite as much. We're going to go to the tower team concepts now. There is no absolute divisions of responsibilities regarding position operations. The task is to be completed as a whole between 1, 2, or 3 people within the facility or sector. The team as a whole has responsibility for the safe and efficient operation of that facility or sector. However, that doesn't mean that ground control is responsible for local control if they violate runway operations or reduce runway separation. We still have position responsibilities. And that brings us down to the actual position responsibilities for local. Your job is to ensure separation, initiate control instructions, monitor and operate communications equipment like the RSI, utilize tower radar display, utilize alphanumerics, assist the tower coordinator position with coordination, Scan the tower cab environment. Ensure computer entries are completed for instructions or clearances issued and received. So that would be something like the IDS-5 or the AFAS. Ensure strip marking is completed for instructions or clearances issued or received. And perform any functions of the tower team which will assist in meeting the situation objectives. A good example of that would be the flyby line. We coordinate for the flyby line because ground control has a requirement to hold aircraft at a certain place on taxiway Charlie, and so that's why it's required by local. And it's important to remember that that's your requirement in local control and not your coordinator's requirement. You can use your coordinator, you can coordinate with them to make these things happen for you, strip marking, etc. However, they are your responsibilities. That's really important to remember that, so you don't get lackadaisical and think, oh, well, local control normally does this. However, you need to understand it's your job. We're going to move down to task 3 with apply ATC communication procedures, apply inter and intra-facility coordination. Again, I'm not going to hit every single one of these because that would take forever, and some of them are really self-explanatory, but we will touch on some high notes. First, monitoring. This happens a lot when we're monitoring other frequencies or other positions, like control coordinator monitoring local control, or you monitoring ground prior to do interphone transmissions. Pilot acknowledgement or readback. It's really critical to get readback of instructions, especially the runway designation, holding short, any sort of restrictions on departure or special departure clearance instructions. Authorized transmissions. Transmissions are authorized only the messages necessary for air traffic control or otherwise contributing to air safety. That means we're not going to be asking about the ball game or what the weather's like somewhere else. It's not important for us. False and deceptive communications. What these are mostly, if you don't know, anybody can get a VHF transmitter and start making VHF transmissions. And so somebody could pick up a radio from Radio Shack and they could be making transmissions that are going to mess up and interfere with our operations. And so it's important that as soon as we hear stuff like that, we tell them to maintain radio silence. And if it continues, then we get a hold of frequency management, and they can actually track down specifically, like an ELT, and find out exactly where they're coming from. Authorized relays. Relay operational information to aircraft or aircraft operations as necessary. Do not agree to handle such messages on a regular basis. This would be just certain information like between pilots. Like if pilots say, hey, coordinate with weather to do this, coordinate with weather to do that, and it's something that becomes a habit, we need to let them know that there's pilot dispatch they can communicate on, and so that way they can not cloud up air traffic control frequencies. Typically it's not a problem, and accommodating this is like an additional duty as long as we only do it every now and again. Interphone message priorities. Give priority to interphone transmissions as follows. It's going to be emergency transmissions. And our second priority is going to be clearances and control instructions. And then third is the movement and control messages. What's really important to think about when we're thinking about making transmissions, if it's not an emergency aircraft, we want to work from the runway out in local. So that means if someone's checking in over the TACAN, you don't just necessarily need to reply to them right away just because they're the last ones to call, even though that happens pretty often. What you want to do is you want to work the runway out. The closest aircraft that needs any sort of traffic or the closest aircraft to the runway is the one that should be transmitted first. And then you move out to the other aircraft that are farther out. Priority interruptions, use the words emergency or control. And a good example of this is if we're doing a mission. And the mission, there's a lot of chatter between the control room and the actual pilot, and something comes up where we have to issue traffic. We can say control or break for control, and then you say, zoom to 1, traffic F-16 of the TACAN. You guys know how to terminate transmissions, time. Field elevation. What's important to think about for field elevation is the field elevation is the highest point on a landing surface on that field. So for Edwards, we're going to have it on runway 23. But at another place, they may have mountains that are higher on the airfield. However, that's not the actual field elevation. The field elevation is the highest point on a landing surface. Aircraft identification. Use the full identification and reply to aircraft with similar sounding identities. Example of this would be if you had a November 108 Echo Zulu and a 128 Echo Zulu. You wouldn't want to abbreviate those transmissions because they're both going to be Echo Zulu. It's going to be November 108 Echo Zulu and 128 Echo Zulu. And if the pilots start to differentiate from that and they keep shortening it, you need to let them know, please use your full phonetic. All right, now we're going to go down to explain when interphones will be used. Intercoms will be utilized for inter-facility coordination to the maximum extent possible. We do this for three main reasons. Legally, we want to cover our butts, and we want to make sure that if we make a transmission and it's recorded, we can go back to that later on just to verify that we made those transmissions. Noise level within the tower cab. We don't want the noise level to be too great in the tower cab. And if everybody's using non-interphone transmissions, it could be loud. The other reason is because there's other things going on in the tower cab and it's quite loud. You actually break through all that with the intercom because it goes directly into the controller's ear, and they're able to stop what they're doing or think about what's going on in a different way. Yeah, it's really helpful for that. Describe the use of the word heavy in terminal environment. We're going to use it with all communications with or about heavy aircraft. That's important for you, so it reminds you what's going on. And it's also important to remind the flying community that there is a heavy aircraft doing something, whether it's on the ground and it's taxiing and the aircraft will want to be taxiing behind it, or it's in the air and they're creating a greater amount than normal weight turbulence. The pilot may be in its cockpit, just focus on what's going on in its airplane, especially like an emergency aircraft. And so you want to remind everybody that, hey, look, you're flying around heavy aircraft and there's going to be weight turbulence that you could be flying through. Describe a transfer of radio communication procedures. Transfer control of an aircraft in accordance with the following conditions at a prescribed or coordinated location, time, fix, or altitude. And so what that is for us is aircraft are going to switch radio frequencies at certain points. For our fighter jet aircraft, they're going to switch off the departure in. And then our heavy aircraft and cargo aircraft, we have to switch them. But we want to transfer control of an aircraft only after eliminating any potential conflict with other aircraft for which you have separation responsibilities. That's why it's important to let aircraft know to remain your frequency if you give them sort of instructions or traffic instructions that are determinate upon other aircraft flying in our airspace, like the flyby line, departure off runway 23 right. And so we want to make sure we have to eliminate that. Either we give them a control instruction to exit our airspace in a way in which we'll deconflict from that. Example with that if with the flyby pattern active would be to maintain runway heading until passing 4,000 and then make a right-hand turn out and let them know that the flyby line is active. That's where you have to do that. Otherwise, if you just give them the clearance and you by the departure in and they transfer, that's on you. And you want to assume control of an aircraft only after it's in your area of jurisdiction unless specifically coordinated or specified by a letter of agreement or facility directive. That means when you're getting transfer control of an aircraft from Sport, we don't have to take control of that aircraft before they get to our airspace. And sometimes when Sport or Joshua inbounds them from 30 miles away, we might say, hey, keep on your frequency until he gets to the TACAN. It's important to do that sometimes because then you're working aircraft way far outside your delta. And then at that point, once they're on your frequency, any sort of traffic calls or collision avoidance is on you. State which position has the primary responsibility for operations on the active runway. That's local control. That runway is your runway. It's not the flight data, the watch soups, or ground controls. That's your runway. You got to make sure that you're always in control of that aircraft or that runway. Describe coordination required between local control and ground control prior to approving an aircraft or vehicle to cross or use any portion of an active runway, to include phraseology required. That's why when ground control requests to cross the runway, local controller must verbally specify the runway to be crossed at the point intersection of that runway where the operation will occur, preceded by the word cross. And so that's really important for us in the tower cab so that we're not approving something at another place. Ground control could be confused, and they could say request to cross runway 23 right at Bravo, when actually what they mean is 23 left at Bravo. And that's why it's important that we verbatim read back cross at that intersection point. Describe when low control coordination is required with ground control prior to using a runway not designed or designated as active runway. Again, ramp 2 is a good example of this. Whenever we're having an aircraft land on ramp 2, we need to coordinate with ground control. Describe when coordination is required between low control when departing an aircraft. When a departing aircraft has been taxied to a runway not previously designated as active. That's if ground's going to be launching somebody from ramp 2 or send somebody from ramp 2 or to the lake bed or to runway 23 right at an intersection. Now we're going to slide down to task 4, maintaining surveillance of the surface area, maintain surveillance of the control movement area. We're going to define these areas and kind of talk about them for a second. A movement area, the runway and taxiways, and other areas of an airport or helipad which are utilized for taxiing, hover taxiing, air taxiing, takeoff, and landing of aircraft, exclusive of loading ramps and parking areas. At those airports, helipads, with tower-specific approval for entry into the movement area must be obtained from ATC. I'm going to pull up our local map here for a second. So what we're talking about at Edwards specifically, we're only talking about the defined movement areas in the 13204, which is going to be the Rogers Lake Bed, South Roseman Lake Bed, north of South Base runway 24, or just north and south base runways, and then 23 left and 23 right. That does not include taxiways or the ramps, even though those are in the defined area of movement area. And that's because of these next sections. Non-movement area is a taxiway or aprons, areas not under control of air traffic. So that would be what we're talking about. We're talking about the actual runway here, or the actual taxiways that are not under control of air traffic. So other airports that you're going to work at, you're going to have those areas actually be movement areas. And so those movement areas, you can land helicopters on, or you can do other operations, but they require specific approval to cross. That's why we have spots where we can cross over from the main ramp here across taxiway Echo and come to the control tower. You don't need air traffic approval for that. But if that was a movement area, we would specifically need that. Describe local control's responsibility to visually scan runways. Local controller must visually scan runways to the maximum extent possible. And again, this is for human error. Whenever we are working up there, we can have aircraft that's not off the runway or a vehicle that's close, and scan the runway is going to be big for that. All right, we're going back down to task 5, determine aircraft's position on the airfield. State when the local controller must determine aircraft's position for a departing aircraft. Local control must determine the position of an aircraft before issuing taxi instructions or taxi clearance, takeoff clearance. What's really important about that is if we have bad visibility or it's at night, if you don't go out there and look with your binoculars, or if you can't see because we have ground fog, we can still issue a clearance. But we'll go to the next section here. What are the ways to determine an aircraft's position on the airfield? Visually, via display system, which is some airports, they have like ground radar, and they can tell exactly where an aircraft is, specifically with squawk codes. Or when the previous ways are unable, position reports may be used. So you can say, confirm you're at runway 23 left at taxiway Bravo. And then the aircraft can confirm that, and then you can actually do that. But that's what you must do. You must determine that aircraft's position on the airfield prior to issuing taxi instructions. And that's so you don't confuse it with some other portion of the runway or airfield. Okay, now we're going to go down to task 6, bailout, abandonment of aircraft, external stores, jettison, and fuel dumping. So for Edwards, our bailout area is going to be out here on the lake bed, and I believe this is lake bed runway 725, and so, or 927. And actually, what it's actually in, it's in the Alpha Corridor West Range area. So this is Alpha Corridor here, and then here's your West and East Range, and that's where our dumping areas are going to be. is right in there. And the reason they do that is because we have designated areas for that. And this is a controlled movement area. And so we can ensure that there's nobody in it. It's the same thing with the ranges. The ranges can ensure that there's nobody in the ranges at certain points in times. And so, because everything requires access out there. So that's for us. That's where they are. And that's the reason that we do those. State the primary location for jettison. That's in the PIRA, which PIRA is the west and east range combined. And that was a quick task. So now we're going to move on to task 7. Down to task 7, issue takeoff landing clearances, cancel takeoff landing clearances, and issue landing information. So the phraseology for issuing takeoff clearances is pretty basic. The runway, follow the runway and anywhere if they're at a taxiway, and then the wind and clear for takeoff. We only use the word full length if an aircraft is at an intersection and has called ready for departure. If the aircraft has not called ready for departure, then we don't do it. The reason for that is because if there's aircraft is ready for departure, we can mess up call signs and we don't tell them, full length, and we can actually get some confusion with that. The phraseology or state U.S. Air Force requirements to issue traffic to aircraft cleared for takeoff. We issue traffic for aircraft cleared for takeoff. Really, for us, it's going to be anybody that's going to be pertinent for it. Any traffic that we might have as far as being close to the runway, on base or on final, or off the departure in its flight path. The reasons we would cancel takeoff clearance would be any sort of the way we forget about a vehicle on the runway, or we try to do reduce same runway separation, and we have aircraft depart, and there's another aircraft on the runway, and that aircraft has some sort of issue, and so we cannot use that now. We don't have the 6,000 feet in airborne, and so we would cancel that clearance. It's important to use the exact phraseology, cancel takeoff clearance, and then say why. To cancel takeoff clearance, aircraft landing roll, cancel takeoff clearance, traffic. State who to issue landing information to and when the information may be omitted. This is going to be anybody that's going to switch over into our frequency. For departures, that's going to be the ATIS code and any pertinent information. For arrivals, that's going to be anybody that comes to us, unless we have a letter of agreement stating that the radar facility that's transferring in the aircraft is required to do it, which we don't have that right now with Sport, but Sport does it. But there is required information that we're supposed to do. Either we give them the ATIS and they go and get the ATIS and then come back on our frequencies. Otherwise, we have to give them the runway in use, the surface wind, the altimeter setting, any supplementary information. We could give a clearance to land at that time. A request for additional position reports, like report TACAN, report 5 mile final. Ceiling or visibility, if either is below VFR minimum. Low level wind shear, braking action. Runway condition codes. Any opposite direction traffic that we may have. Or if the pilot does not indicate that they have the ATIS code, that's when we have all these things we have to give out, like when the runway's been shortened, when there's an aircraft holding in position for an opposite direction operation. And so what's important to remember is that if they don't call up with the correct ATIS code, we have to give them any and all of the information, especially if we have weather coming in and we get below any sort of VFR minimums. We have to do that on initial contact. A state phraseology to issue a landing clearance, runway, wind, and cleared to land. Now, that's a U.S. Air Force specific thing. The actual phraseology is just runway and cleared to land. But U.S. Air Force requirements require us to also issue the wind with a landing clearance. State when to restate the landing runway with the clearance. If the landing runway is changed, controllers must preface the landing clearance with change to runway. And so if we have an aircraft on final for 23 left and we want them to go to 23 right, we must use the exact phraseology of change to runway 23 right. Describe when we can withhold a landing clearance. We're not supposed to withhold any landing clearances, but an example would be if aircraft is holding in position and someone says they're 5 mile final, and then we'll tell them, continue, and then we'll give traffic. State what cleared for the option authorizes. Aircraft cleared for the option are cleared to do a touch and go, low approach, missed approach, stop and go, or a full stop landing. And it's really important when you're thinking about using the the option is that when you do that, you can no longer ensure runway separation. You can't use or reduce same runway separation because you don't know what that aircraft's going to do. Even if they do appear to be rolling on a touch and go, they may not be. And so they may have encounter issue, they may have hit a bird or whatever, and then they're just going to put their nose back down, apply the brakes, and now you're in a situation. So whenever you use the option, you cannot use reduce same runway separation. State when not to clear an aircraft for a full stop touch and go or option, or unrestricted low approach. That's going to be when you have an aircraft line up and wait. Describe what will be ensured when a takeoff clearance or landing clearance is issued. You're ensuring that their runway is free from any sort of hazards. You're ensuring that they have runway separation. You're ensuring that runway surface is 100% good for them to land at. Describe what will be included when clearing an aircraft to land, touch and go, or stop and go, or low approach, or for the option. Or what will be included. You must include the runway identifier, along with surface winds, and any other pertinent information. Vehicles right of the runway, left of the runway, any sort of special markings on the runway that might be different for them. Maybe the barrier status if it's other than what it's published normally. Describe how to issue a landing clearance to formation flights. You just say clear to land. You treat them as one aircraft. If the second aircraft says request clear to land or request a clearance, then you could just tell them, or you confirm you're part of the flight, and you say Roger, then you can say flight clear to land. But they should not come back with that. Every once in a while they'll come back with it. We're not the lead, wants to do something else like a low approach. If you clear them low approach, you're accepting responsibility for separation. If they're a flight, and you clearing the leader of the flight clears the whole flight for the same. So now we're going to move down to task 8, issue runway exiting instructions. State the phraseology to instruct aircraft where to turn off the runway after landing. So you have the phraseology. You want to make sure that they're at a safe speed. So that means that all of their gears are on the ground, so their main and their nose gear on the ground, and that they're at a safe taxiing speed. So they're not going 180 knots down the runway. That's when you can issue taxi instructions. If it looks like they're 100% going to make a taxiway, you can give them instructions of turn left or right. If you're not sure, you can say if able. It really helps when you have an aircraft exiting the runway and they're at a decent speed, but they're not at taxi speed yet, and you want them to exit at a runway. We don't have to issue local aircraft runway exiting instructions, but what we'd want to do it for would be specifically if an aircraft's behind them when we're trying to reduce same runway separation. The aircraft may not be aware of that, and so by saying the word if able, like Zoom 21 if able to exit at taxiway Bravo, traffic in this 3-mile final, heavy C-17. And that would give them incentive to try to help you out with that. Otherwise, it's not required. Describe when taxi instructions shall be provided to an aircraft by the local controller. That's when we're going to have an aircraft exit the runway and we control runway 23 right, or any of the runway that they have to cross, or if you have an intersecting runway. A good example would that be for like Mojave Airport, or any other airport that has intersecting runways. You may have an aircraft land on runway 30. You're going to give them exit instructions and taxi instructions to enter runway 26 and then exit at taxiway Alpha. And so that's when you would keep them on your frequency specifically. For Edwards, that's going to come up when you have an aircraft on the runway, landing on runway 23 left, and local control owns runway 23 right, and then you're going to have them exit and give them taxi instructions of holding short or crossing because it's on your runway. You control the access to those runways. That's task 8. Now we're going to task 9. Describe the intent with issuing wheels down check. The intent is to not put sole responsibility on the controller, but on the pilot to lower the wheels, not place it on the controller. It's really, really important to issue wheels down check. I got some videos I'm going to show you here in a second. State when controllers do not have to issue the wheels down check. That's only when the pilot previously said that he had his gear down. He might say 3 green or gear down. State when the controller shall issue the wheels down check. Remind the aircraft to check wheels down at each appropriate place in the pattern. That depends on what pattern they're in, but we're going to say issue wheels down check at that point. And so here, what's really important about that is that when you have an aircraft, they may see 3 green, or they may say that they have their gear down, and it's important to scan the runways and to look at them with binoculars, because here's the diagram of the layout of the back behind the gear doors and the fluids that are actually making the indicators for the gear to go down. And all it is here is the gear up check valve. This check valve here could get stuck, and so it may get stuck in the down position or it may get stuck in the up position, and so it may indicate that their gear is up. And we've seen it before where an aircraft has their gear up and they've departed, but their gear is actually down, but they're indicating it as being up. Same thing when they're landing. They could have aircraft indicate that they have good gear indication. However, it may not be. It may actually be up in the aircraft still. This is a view of an aircraft that's simulated, but this aircraft landing with the gear and not all the way down. And so what you see here is the aircraft coming down. This one hasn't collapsed. In real life, it probably would collapse. And then you'll see here that the engine is actually touching the runway and could possibly explode at that point, or have a major fire and probably cartwheel off the runway. Here, this is a belly down landing of an aircraft recently. And that's what happens. So in this case, it's okay because the aircraft is clean on the bottom, but an F-16 landing gear up has a big scoop underneath. It will not be okay for that aircraft, or even the other aircraft in the previous video. Landing on there would be a terrible thing for them. This is an actual business jet landing, and see it caught on fire. And they had to go out and do something for once. This is another example. This guy came down. He did a pretty good job. But while they're doing this, why these aircraft's landing like this is because they had a problem with their gear and they can't get it down. And so they had to land. And you can look at his prop right there, hit the ground and struck all the way around. So that engine's done. And you guys can let me know if you want me to put more videos in the future. We're going to go to our final task, task 10, issue departure information, issue departure control instructions. So I'll let me pull up our local map with our spin areas. Departure information contained in the ATIS may be omitted if the pilot states they have the appropriate ATIS code. So when ground's issuing taxi instructions and giving them the ATIS information, we can omit that for departure. However, if the aircraft something changed and they were off frequency, we're required to do that. But we must issue the runway in use, surface wind from the direction of the directional readout, time when requested, the official ceiling or visibility when available to departing aircraft if it's below VFR minimums or VFR conditions, or IFR aircraft when it's below VFR conditions, or it's below the highest takeoff minimum. We don't have to do it in the Air Force, but outside the Air Force, you have to say check density altitude when the temperature is above a certain degree, and that's because the air is going to be thinner, and they need to understand that they're going to have different departure characteristics and lift characteristics. They may not have enough runway length. Issue braking action instruction for the runway, and runway condition codes if you have them, or any opposite direction operations. Even though you may not be at that situation where you have an aircraft who's coming in opposite direction on runway 5, they may not be in the class Delta even yet, but you got to issue those instructions for departing aircraft. They have to issue that traffic because they may take longer on the runway, and by the time they actually roll and switch frequencies, it's going to be a problem for them. Describe Edwards procedures for departing aircraft to change the departure frequency to include daytime VFR, transport and cargo types, nighttime VFR, and civil aircraft. So for Edwards, when sports open, unless otherwise instructed, during VFR conditions, all departing, or daytime VFR, all departing turboprop, turbojet aircraft will auto switch to departure frequency crossing the departure end of the runway. Again, that's why it's important that we give any information, like the west spin being active, or the lake bed, or the north spin, or anything that's going to be out here, maybe the housing DZ, prior to the aircraft departure roll, because when they get airborne, they're in the critical phase of flight till they get clean, and they may not do that till close to the departure end, depending on the aircraft type. And then we only have a few seconds to talk to them before they switch frequencies. During nighttime or IFR operations, we're going to tell the aircraft to change the departure. So at night, we'll switch them over to the sport's still open, or Joshua has the airspace. We're going to say change the departure, and that's for all turboprop aircraft. During daytime or nighttime VFR or IFR operations, Tower informs all departing civil aircraft and military transport cargo aircraft to change the departure control frequency approximately a half mile beyond the departure end. So that would be all of our KC-135s, C-17s, and C-12s. Again, that's why it's super important to make sure that we're looking out the window, and we're making sure that the west bins are active. We're scanning our IDS-5, and we're making sure that nothing is going to be a problem for them for departure prior to issuing the exiting instructions or the clearance for takeoff. Now, this is the end of episode 1, and I hope it wasn't too bad. Any sort of feedback you guys want to have for the future, or anything you like that you want more of, or you didn't like and you want less of, let me know. Thanks for watching.